In the 13th century, Kublai Khan built the largest contiguous empire in human history. His armies conquered China, Korea, Burma, and Vietnam. His fleets controlled the seas. His Mongol forces seemed unstoppable. But there's one place in Southeast Asia that Kublai Khan never invaded: the Philippines. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't because he didn't know the islands existed. Chinese traders had been doing business with Philippine kingdoms for centuries. Kublai Khan knew exactly where the Philippines was. So why did the most powerful conqueror of his age, a man who sent invasion fleets to Japan twice, completely skip the Philippine archipelago? The answer reveals something important about Mongol military strategy, Philippine geography, and why some places are simply too difficult to conquer, even for the greatest empire builders in history. To understand why Kublai Khan avoided the Philippines, you need to understand how Mongol conquest actually worked. The Mongols weren't just good fighters. They were strategic conquerors who carefully calculated cost versus benefit before every campaign. They didn't invade places randomly. They invaded places worth conquering. Mongol military doctrine was built around mobility, fast-moving cavalry covering vast distances, supply lines that could stretch across thousands of miles, psychological warfare that made cities surrender without fighting, and most importantly, the ability to quickly consolidate conquered territory. This system worked brilliantly on the steppes and in continental Asia, China, Persia, Russia. These were places where Mongol tactics dominated. But island warfare? That was different. Kublai Khan learned this lesson the hard way with Japan. In 1274, and again in 1281, he sent massive invasion fleets, the largest amphibious operations in history up to that point. Both times, the invasions failed catastrophically. Storms destroyed much of the fleet. Japanese resistance was fierce. The cost was enormous. By the 1280s, Kublai Khan understood something crucial. Naval invasions against island nations were expensive, risky, and often failed even when you had overwhelming force. Now consider the Philippines, not one island like Japan. An archipelago of over 7,000 islands spread across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. No single capital to capture, no unified kingdom to defeat. Just dozens of independent barangays, sultanates, and kingdoms scattered across an impossibly complex geography. From a Mongol strategic perspective, this was a nightmare scenario. Let's talk about what the Philippines actually offered as a conquest target in the 1200s. Chinese records from the Song and Yuan dynasties mention regular trade with various Philippine polities. They imported gold, pearls, tortoise shells, and other goods. But these weren't massive trade volumes. The Philippines was economically significant, but not essential. Compare this to Java or Sumatra, major centers of the spice trade, or Vietnam, which controlled important trade routes and rice production, or Burma, which bordered Chinese territory and represented a strategic threat. The Philippines had value, but not enough value to justify a massive naval invasion campaign, especially when Chinese traders could simply continue doing business with Philippine kingdoms without military conquest. There was no urgent strategic reason to invade. The islands didn't threaten Mongol territory. They didn't block critical trade routes. They weren't accumulating military power that could challenge Mongol dominance. From Kublai Khan's perspective, the Philippines was a collection of small kingdoms doing their own thing thousands of miles away. Interesting, but not worth the extraordinary cost and risk of conquest. Now let's examine the military challenges the Mongols would have faced if they had tried to invade. First, logistics. Mongol armies traveled with thousands of horses. Their cavalry tactics required vast numbers of mounts, but horses don't do well on ships. And even if you could transport them, where would you pasture thousands of horses in a tropical archipelago? The Philippine Islands in the 1200s were heavily forested with limited open grassland. This alone would have crippled Mongol military effectiveness. Their core tactical advantage, fast-moving cavalry, becomes almost useless in jungle and island terrain. Second, naval operations. The Mongols were continental people. They learned naval warfare out of necessity when conquering China, but they never excelled at it. The two Japan invasion disasters prove that. Now imagine trying to coordinate a naval campaign across 7,000 islands. You can't just sail to one place, conquer it, and call the job done. You'd need to subdue dozens of separate kingdoms, each requiring its own amphibious assault, each with its own defensive advantages. And Philippine maritime technology wasn't primitive. The barangay, the traditional Philippine vessel, was sophisticated, fast, maneuverable, perfect for the archipelago's waters. Filipino sailors knew every current, every reef, every hidden passage. Mongol naval forces would be fighting in completely unfamiliar waters against people who'd grown up on boats. Third, guerrilla warfare. Even if the Mongols managed to land forces and win initial battles, holding territory would be nearly impossible. The Mongols were masters of open field warfare. But jungle combat? Island hopping? Fighting an enemy that could disappear into mountains and forests, resupply by sea, and attack from unexpected directions. That's not the Mongol way of war. Philippine warriors were experienced with small unit tactics, ambushes, and terrain advantages. They'd been fighting each other and defending against pirates for generations. A Mongol army trying to occupy the islands would face endless harassment from forces they couldn't pin down and destroy. There's another factor that's often overlooked. Political fragmentation actually made the Philippines harder to conquer, not easier. When the Mongols invaded China, they could focus on defeating the Song dynasty. One government, one military, one strategic objective. Win enough battles, capture the capital, and suddenly you control vast territories. But the Philippines in the 1200s had no central authority, no emperor to defeat, no capital city whose fall would end the war. Instead, you had dozens of independent datus, rajas, and sultans, each controlling their own territory, each with their own warriors, each requiring separate military campaigns to subdue. Even if the Mongols conquered one kingdom, the others wouldn't automatically surrender. You'd have to fight the same campaign over and over, island after island, kingdom after kingdom. It would be a decades-long project with no guarantee of success. And for what? Control of territories that produced modest trade goods and had no strategic value to the Mongol Empire? From a cost-benefit analysis, it made no sense. The timing matters too. By the time Kublai Khan had fully consolidated control over China and could theoretically think about expanding into Southeast Asia, his empire was already facing serious problems. The Yuan dynasty was expensive to run. The two failed Japan invasions had cost enormous amounts of money and resources. Internal rebellions were starting. The empire was near its maximum sustainable extent. Kublai Khan was a brilliant administrator. He understood that empires can overextend themselves. He'd seen what happened when his grandfather Genghis Khan's empire fractured because it grew too large to govern effectively. So rather than launching risky, expensive campaigns against island kingdoms, Kublai Khan focused on consolidating what he already had. He invested in internal administration, trade infrastructure, and maintaining control over the territories that actually mattered to Mongol power. The Philippines simply wasn't worth the risk, especially after the Japan disasters showed how badly naval invasions could go wrong. There's also the question of climate and disease. Mongol forces were adapted to the steppes and northern climates. Tropical diseases would have devastated an invasion force. The Philippines in the 1200s had malaria, dengue fever, and various other tropical diseases that would have been unfamiliar to Mongol soldiers. We know from later historical examples that disease often killed more invaders than combat did in tropical regions. Without modern medicine, a Mongol army landing in the Philippines would face not just military resistance, but biological threats they had no immunity to. This alone could have rendered an invasion force ineffective within weeks. Here's what I think is the most important point. Kublai Khan didn't skip the Philippines because he was afraid of Filipino military power. He skipped it because he was smart enough to recognize a bad strategic investment. The Mongols were conquerors, but they were rational conquerors. They calculated costs and benefits. They assessed risks. They didn't just attack everything they could reach. The Philippines represented high invasion cost due to naval operations, extreme difficulty conquering fragmented kingdoms across an archipelago, ongoing occupation challenges in jungle and island terrain, limited economic or strategic value compared to the investment required, serious risk of catastrophic failure like the Japan invasions. From a strategic perspective, The smart move was exactly what Kublai Khan did. Maintain trade relations, collect some tribute through intermediaries, and focus resources on territories that were actually worth conquering. This doesn't diminish Philippine warriors or kingdoms. If anything, it shows that sometimes the best defense is simply not being worth the trouble to attack. So what does this tell us about the Philippines in the 13th century? First, the archipelago geography that makes the Philippines vulnerable to some threats, like modern maritime disputes, actually protected it from land-based empires. The same fragmentation that prevented political unity also prevented conquest by forces built around cavalry and continental warfare. Second, the Filipino maritime tradition and naval capabilities, while often overlooked in history books, were significant enough that even the Mongols, who had already conquered most of the known world, didn't think it was worth challenging them in their own waters. Third, the decentralized political structure that some historians view as a weakness was actually a strategic advantage against empire builders. You can't decapitate a government that doesn't exist. Kublai Khan skipped the Philippines not because he couldn't conquer it. With enough resources, probably he could have, but because the return on investment didn't justify the effort. Sometimes the greatest military victory is recognizing which battles not to fight. And the Philippines, with its 7,000 islands, jungle terrain, skilled maritime warriors, and fragmented kingdoms, was exactly the kind of battle the Mongols were smart enough to avoid.